and welcome to this special edition of Guadoga TV. This is part 2 of our series on the Seigneury of Sault-Saint-Louis. In this episode, Elder Billy Two Rivers talks about the French regime and the impact it had on our ancestors' way of life, as well as the impact it had on the size of Kahnawa'kehr's territory. In keeping with our oral tradition, Billy tells us some of the events that occurred during the French crown's rule from an elder's point of view and in Kahnawa'kehró. We've translated Billy's words into English. Following Billy's interview, we will go over some of the important points and facts that occurred during the French regime. These facts are based on joint research conducted by the Mohawk Council of Kahnawa'kehró and the federal government. They can also be found in the Seigneury of Sault-Saint-Louis historical pamphlet. We hope that this series will help you understand the history behind our long-standing land grievance, a dispute that has been ongoing for more than 300 years.
We now continue the story of our land, known as the Seigneury of Sault-Saint-Louis. I'm going to try to clarify the outcome of the joint initiative on the Seigneury that will address certain issues.
Seigneury, the one nugget, the one, the what the Hunzoni, is what I'm the dirty what is in what he was soon, I know who's already walk. Honestly, the way here, I get the.
When the French and the priests first came here around 1640, there was a period that was like a vacuum. You have to understand that we took care of them so that they could survive in this harsh land. People like Jacques Cartier and Champlain came from France as we took care of them when they got here. In 1611, they told us that it was time to put our differences aside. However, our respect for them was jarred, and peace was jeopardized, and a war was started. In the village of Chambly, where there was a customs house, 3 Kahnawa'kehró were shot. The war lasted for 70 years until 1701.
was told
It was during this time that they started taking our land. As they grew in size, they began asserting their assumed jurisdiction over our land. If you remember where I started in the first episode, I spoke of a place where the turtles lived. That was called Kahnawa'kehró. The priest set up a village there too, which is now called La Prairie.
ne watu na da kwe aweni the wanagare the signore wahun kanya da da je dano signore ano warege
We too lived there at the time, and we remember that the Seigneury started in 1680. The King of France gave the land to our ancestors. Our ancestors and the priests lived there together, and that's where they started asserting their jurisdiction over our land. It was during this time that the Jesuits started to give away our land near La Prairie in the Seigneury of Sault Ste. Louis. I'll continue my story here. It all started with the fur trade and beaver pelts. During the fur trade, we sold our furs to either the French or the English, whoever would pay more. As time went on, the French began traveling to where the beavers were, but they constantly complained of harassment on the St. Lawrence River. The French then asked for a meeting to discuss an agreement with Kahnawa'kehró and other nations for peace. They asked to be protected on their journeys up and down the St. Lawrence River. This led to the Seven Nations Treaty. This agreement was made by the French, so it wouldn't be dangerous for them to get their beaver pelts. I want you to understand that this is a story and that you can't understand it all just by watching the show. Between 1701 and 1761, the King of France only knew what the priests were telling him. As fast as he signed his name to the document giving us the Seigneury, they then turned over our land to the settlers. The king made agreements that the Jesuits would take care of our interests in the Seigneury. The white man was not supposed to live on our land, but the Jesuits let them.
Yatadinzo to Hadinagarega. Then the Havdaso in the Hansazi Asagodini Radinaraga. So Kida Hondaso Zinagero, what anyhow rent Wahadigaria.
The Jesuits charged the settlers rent, but none came to us. The priest then started to sell our land, and our ancestors told them that they had no business doing that. As more and more people started settling on our land, the chiefs began protesting that the Jesuits had no right to give away our land. The Jesuits argued that they needed the money for the repair and the upkeep of the church and the grist mill.
Doga tenno yawen en den so am zut quadago gi onsi ga wistayandage. Nari wo oni you teenigi dan you ga wistayanda and
The Jesuits said that they needed the rent money.
Am zaga quadago. Sahaki dar di waya and you ga sotsalo wa oniru yatade quada hunzoni to adi nagarege.
We still didn't agree, saying that this is our land.
Toki agiru jodaso.
That's when we started to fight for our land, and today we're still fighting for it. We're doing what we can to make it right. To this day, they still haven't paid what is owed. Now we're talking with the government about land or money. That is the reason that we're in this land grievance process. We lost the use of our lands and the rent was not paid. It's now time to rectify these breaches and injustices. The non-payment of the rents is the heart of our claim, and this is why we're here today. We want you to understand that we were tired of complaining to the Jesuits about what they were doing. In 1750, we took this to court, and it was ruled in our favor. We wrote to the king, and he wrote back and said that the land in question belongs to the Mohawks for as long as they stay there.
Seigneury. Zokki rodi hirare dam dari wazarago nerundio waharo ogwe hunwe rao nao ge hunza sinigari was to hadi derundage doga gatke suwa era hunete dana.
But he said, if the Mohawks leave, then the land goes back to the crown. The king told the Jesuits to stop selling the land.
Kahnawa'kehró rao nao tiunza tanu radiji hastaji ahunderissa ji rudeni haske hunza togi na awonegi ne gayana sraga ya hadi hawe negi tunichi watari wazarago nerundio Kahnawa'kehró rao nao.
The king said as long as there's one Mohawk, then the land is still theirs.
Watsin yore ne anskana ro huwe so dadaro ram runu haro now. Dogayaro hunete ischena. Togi nichi wahadili wantegi.
By doing this, the king strengthened our belief that the Jesuits were acting wrong.
Razaruni, Ganajan, Oshaaga, Chata Osanaga, Jingari Wisconsin, Wajata News, Tanu, Nene, Agiru, Jota Sagani, Nagine.
At the time, the French were here, and the English were at Albany, and they were at war with each other over whose land this was. The last time that they fought, both sides asked for our neutrality.
Plains of Abraham down to Rio.
When they fought at the Plains of Abraham, we sided with the English, and the French regime ended.
Then Jorda Saga Juti, Neskatne the Waterio. Togi Johawit with the Wateri Wasaruni. Negina on one Wadina.
We were a factor in their defeat.
Ganajan, one Wadina. Onagi Agir Jenichi, Tonica Howie on going on that Nazi Wagatrori on Aon and Tosudaga Howie, Tanu Negin on Yeskata Sudra, Negin the Jorda Saga on.
The next chapter in this story will be about the British regime.
Togi Yeskata Sudra, and Yawanzi was what the dish was what I won't say, Tanu Yeskata Sudra, Giga Darugu, what's going on to New Onaga. (1647). The Jesuit missionaries were granted the Seigneury of La Prairie for the purposes of starting a Catholic mission in the area. It was built as a place of rest for the Jesuit missionaries and to attract the Indians. La Prairie, however, was not settled for another 20 years due to the ongoing conflict between the Iroquois and the French. 1666 to 1667. After almost 60 years of conflict between the French and its native allies and the Five Nations, a treaty of peace between the Iroquois and the French is signed. The Seigneury of La Prairie and areas westward are open to settlement. Increasing numbers of Iroquois peoples, along with people from other nations, moved to the northern part of Kahnawa'kehró territory. They settled at Gandage, and over the next several decades moved 4 times to the present-day site of Kahnawa'kehró in 1716. 1680. The Seigneury of Sault Ste. Louis is granted by King Louis XIV on May 29, 1680. The second grant by Governor Frontenac and Intendant Duchesneau is granted on October 31, 1680. 1701. The Great Peace of Montreal is signed in August. The treaty ended almost a century of warfare between the French and their native allies on one side and the Iroquois on the other. 39 Aboriginal nations sent representatives to Montreal. The treaty brought peace to a vast territory, opened up trade and diplomatic ties, also allowed for the development of the French colony. 1703. The Jesuits conceded Seigneury of Sault Ste. Louis lands to French settlers. Deeds were issued. 1717. The Jesuits asked the French crown to unify the 2 deeds of the Seigneury of Sault Ste. Louis and that it be granted to them in perpetuity. In February 1718, the Regent's Council or French Crown decreed that the seigneury lands were not to be granted in perpetuity to the Jesuits and united the 2 grants into one with the same conditions as the original grants in 1680. 1750. In July, the Mohawks of Kahnawa'kehró lodged a formal complaint against the Jesuits and the Marquis de la Jonquière, then governor of New France, and sent the matter to the French king. In 1754, the new Governor Duquesne came to Kahnawa'kehró to give the Crown's response. He reaffirmed that the lands were not to be conceded by the Jesuits, since they could not concede what they did not own.
Thank you for watching part 2 of this special for Gwadoga TV on the Seigneury of Sault Ste. Louis. Join us next time for part 3 when we take a look at the British regime. Until then, Nyawagoa, dan Onagiwahi.